Gail is an associate professor in the Faculty of Environmental Studies at York University. Her area of research is on avian ecology, primarily focused on colonial nesting waterbirds. Her research is divided into environmental policy studies and field-based studies. The former involves understanding how offshore oil and gas interacts with marine birds. The latter focuses on the nesting waterbirds, double-crested cormorants and black-crowned night herons at Tommy Thompson Park. The work on chimney swifts is done through research with students and as a volunteer for Shift Watch. Sorry. We're hearing about that.
Thank you. Thanks, and I appreciate that there's still a crowd here to talk to. So, as if you know me, you know I get very excited when I talk about chimney swifts, so I'm trying to contain myself, but I am thrilled to be giving this talk. Chimney swifts are a migratory bird. This map kind of cuts it off, but they actually spend a lot of their winter in northern South America and migrate up to eastern North America. This is their global distribution. So you could be considering them an endemic bird to eastern North America when they're not migrating south. So they do breed in eastern North America, and they breed in chimneys. And remarkably, the first account of a chimney swift using a chimney was in 1672. So some historian dragged this up from somewhere. And so there's not many native species that are named after structures, which is, so this is the indication of how long they have been associated with chimneys. And there's data which people have found that suggests that they nested almost exclusively in chimneys since 1790s. So they do nest in chimneys. They build nests that attach to the side of the chimney. So if it's a lined chimney with metal, it doesn't work. It has to be brick or some sort of rough surface. And this fantastic little drawing is looking down the chimney at a chimney swift. I just have some information here. They use the chimney for actual breeding for approximately 38 days, but they will use it for roosting in non-breeding and migration. And so in the breeding, there's usually one breeding pair per chimney, but in some populations they have helpers. So they have these non-breeding adults that also are associated with the pair. And then when they're moving through and migrating north and south, they use chimneys, and you can get hundreds and sometimes thousands of them using a chimney. And it's quite spectacular, and there's one fantastic chimney in Toronto, which I'll tell you about towards the end. So conservation has subsequently really focused on these roosting chimneys because they tend to be really very important for preserving lots of individuals during migration. Chimney swifts are part of a large group of what they call aerial insectivores. These are birds that fly in the wing and catch insects. And these group of species have all shown substantial declines over the last 40 years. So there's this great citizen science data set that was started in the 60s called breeding bird surveys. You can sign up, you can go listen for birds, and so there's this survey data that's happened every year with the same routes, same level of effort more or less. And so these are data that have been compiled by Neville et al., which are Bird Studies Canada, and the black dots are populations which have shown declines. And chimney swifts have shown declines throughout all of their range, not just in their northern range, but throughout all of their range. And so this has been a cause of concern, such that they were listed as threatened in 2007. And this is really when chimney swifts, I'm an ornithologist, so I would see chimney swifts and I go, oh, chimney swifts, But my partner was on the committee of the status of endangered wildlife in Canada at the time that they were listed, so he was on the committee that decided that they demonstrated a decline such that they should be listed. And that's when I really got excited about chimney swifts. So they're threatened. They gave the definition of threatened for COSEWIC and then the Species at Risk Act. And One of the things, so people started looking at habitat. Well, their habitat is the built environment in their breeding range. And so an obvious focus has been on chimneys and the loss of chimneys. So new houses don't have chimneys. They have all this direct venting that happens. Chimneys are removed, they crumble, we're not good at keeping old buildings, or they're capped or lined, which then prevents the swifts from using these chimneys. This is from a group that started a Swift Watch in Ontario, in London, and it's a picture of a London school, a chimney on a school in London that was subsequently capped. The other line of investigation, besides loss of habitat, has been a change in prey. And this has been a big challenge to try and sort out because they eat insects, and so having a historical database on how insects have changed has been a big challenge. So I'm telling you this really cool story where this has been, some data have been found. So there was this chimney at Queen's University in Kingston that was historically used as a roost by chimney swifts, and a researcher abandoned chimneys there for years and years and years, and eventually Queen's capped the chimney. The MNR biologist Jonah Serra has been working on chimney swifts. They went to Queen's and said, would you consider uncapping the chimney? And Queen said, sure, but you gotta clean it out first. So they went into the chimney and found about 4 meters of guano. And so they started digging it out, but they thought, wait a second, like we could core this. So they ended up doing this paleoecological study on this 4-meter guano thing, and they could date the layer with the last nuclear bomb testing in the 60s in Aleutian Islands or something, because of the radioactivity. And they used stable isotope analysis to look at the change in insect prey abundance and found a relationship with DDT that implicated a change in beetle populations, which implicated a change in what swifts were eating. Super cool study, been replicated in another chimney in Connecticut. So they found virtually the same thing. So prey, it seems like, is a problem. There's been a decline in prey and a change in prey availability. So that's the background on swifts. Since they were listed, or even before, there was these naturalists that were interested in it in London, and they started Swift Watch, and it was really just for nerds, right? Because you got to go stand in front of a chimney or by a chimney and just watch it until a chimney swift drops in. And you usually do this at dusk, right? Because they go in to sleep at night. So unlike bats that come out at night, swifts are going to sleep at night. So half an hour before sunset, you go and stand in front of a chimney, which I'll talk about in a minute. But so this was expanded out to Bird Studies Canada, picked up Ontario Swift Watch. It's now been expanded to communities all over Ontario, and you can log in as a volunteer and enter your data. So in 2007 is when I started working, volunteering, collecting data on chimneys. It's an odd thing, right? Because you are just standing there and you're not supposed to take your eyes off the chimney because the swifts can just kind of come out of nowhere and just drop in and be done, and then you're like, what just happened? I just missed everything. And so I started there, but when I started in Toronto, there was just individual people watching chimneys like myself. There wasn't an organized group of people monitoring chimneys across the city of Toronto because of its hugeness. So Swift Watch was like, what do we do in Toronto? Like, it's just like so big. What do we do with it? But eventually they did start it, which I'll describe to you in a minute. But there were monitoring challenges, and Lisa brought it up first, in that many of these are on private property, right? So you have private property issues. This is just in my local neighborhood, which I know very well. Nicole knows it too, but probably not in the form of chimneys. This was a chimney now that's been removed and turned into McDonald's. These are two chimneys this school is slated for redevelopment. This is a bar. This is next to a bar. It's a theater that's been closed for many years, and that's a church. And there was one on a dry cleaner, which I haven't shown. So many of these properties are privately owned. The ones that are publicly owned are more easy to wrap your mind around and deal with, but the ones that are privately owned, you're kind of just standing there going, okay, I'm just going to pretend I'm not really watching your chimney, but I am. So when I first started out, I would just stand there and watch the chimney, right? I'd be standing in alleyways watching the chimney, and people would come up to me and ask me what I'm doing, and like looking at me oddly. And then I realized if I just pretended I was an artist and I was drawing the chimney, and it completely changed how people would look at me. They were like smiling at me and wanting to see my drawing. Like, and I realized I can't draw three-dimensionally. I'm terrible. Like I knew it beforehand. But anyway, so this is one of my drawings. I'm drawing because I'm just like looking. I'm drawing. Right? And now that you have a cell phone, you can just stand there and pretend you're talking on a cell phone. So I've been volunteering. And I just want to show you this one, if I can get this to work, clip that I have. Uh-oh. How do I get this? I see my mouse here, but just click on it. Oh yeah, there you go. I have no volume here. Let me turn it. So this is a church in my local neighborhood, and I found a roost, a fall roost. And there were parishioners coming out of the church in the evening, and there were maybe 150 birds flying above this church, and they were completely oblivious to the fact that there was anything going on. This is Bloor Street, west side. And eventually all of these swifts dropped into this chimney. And so it's something that I really struggle with, because you want them to know that there's this, species threatened, native species threatened with extinction using their property, but then you don't want them to know, because then, what if they, do something that you don't want them to do? So it's been a very interesting process to deal with, and I haven't really been dealing with it because I've just been giving my data to Bird Studies Canada. So the Torontoist, a reporter from the Torontoist, once I found this roost, I told my coordinator, and she got so excited that a reporter noticed her excitement looking at this chimney, and wrote this article called A Secretive Group of Volunteers Watches Toronto's Roof Lines in a Bid to Preserve a Bird's Dwindling Habitat. So it was a very funny article. And, so loss of chimneys has been an issue, and it has been in the news somewhat. This was a house slated for demolition. So when I started, the city of Toronto wasn't dealing with the chimney swift issue. Bird Studies Canada wasn't really dealing with the chimney swift issue, and we eventually all got together, along with a student, Christina Furtado, master's student that I supervised, to try and come up with a way to how can we protect the chimneys in Toronto that we currently have. And this was after many meetings, the format that we came up with. You have this citizen science group that are identifying chimneys that have been used. They address that, they give the address of that chimney to Bird Studies Canada. And then that also goes into the city's database in zoning. And so this Kelly Snow from the environmental planning section of the city. And then, so that data's in this database, and then if a developer wants to, knock down the building, and it has an active chimney, then this kind of red flag goes up, and they have to talk to the ministry and come up with a mitigation. That's theoretically how it's supposed to work. So this is all still pretty new in the last couple of years. And one of the problems is that there are no data properties earlier in the 60s. So we don't have data in the city's data bank for which buildings might have chimneys. I can tell you that I had an experience with a property that in our neighborhood, actually closer to Nicole, but that we identified. I saw it being used. I then saw the sign for redevelopment, and so I contacted both the city and the province. And I'm just going to read you what the response was from the province to the city coordinator, saying, if there are chimneys, if chimney swifts are actively nesting in the chimney, they can't be harmed or harassed. That's the Migratory Bird Convention Act. The structure must not be removed until the birds have left after the nesting season. And if nesting structure and nesters be removed, it has to be authorized under the Endangered Species Act. So there are some Ontario regulations about removing it, but essentially that the developer had to apply for an Endangered Species Act permit to remove the chimney after the chimney swifts were done. There's been success elsewhere where a school was knocked down. It was known local roost for chimneys. They did a mitigation. They knocked down the chimney, saved the bricks, knocked down the building, rebuilt the chimney, and the swifts used it. So there is possibility. There's in terms of design, because they're declining throughout their range. There has been work of building artificial chimneys in the southern United States. But they do not work in Canada or in northern parts because they're more for warmer climates. So they're made out of wood and out of brick. And there's another great piece that a colleague sent to me about somebody who's teaching people how to make bricks as a living. Has started having his students, the bricks that they make for their, how to practice would be turned into chimneys that could be put up in parks. So Joseph Nazera, that I mentioned earlier, the M&R biologist, has found, though, that there doesn't seem to be an issue of habitat shortage in the northern part of their range. They do acknowledge that you have to have protection of the existing chimneys, because if you keep getting rid of all the chimneys, then there won't be any habitat left. Because they did some work that looked at and found that 75% of suitable sites were actually unoccupied. So it doesn't seem as though there's a crunch around habitat and it's likely more prey. But they did identify a mitigation for existing chimneys and said that this was maybe more of a managed strategy, that the swifts appear to prefer chimneys extending approximately 3 meters over roof height. So these ones that they're building it on the ground is actually probably also not a preferred site for swifts. So I've probably gotten way faster than I need to, but I'm going to go. I realized I put this my thank you slide ahead of this. So education has been really important, and Swift Watch and Bird Studies Canada has undertaken trying to educate the public about swifts and educating organizations like chimney cleaners. Because what you don't want is a chimney cleaner to come in the middle of the summer and clean a chimney, which is when most people might have their chimney cleaned because of the possibility of swifts nesting in them. And so this is an example of a Swift Watch, a night out where they have these coordinated efforts where people across the city are simultaneously watching chimneys to get some idea of how many birds we might have while they're roosting. And this is Moss Park Armory. Is anybody on Queen Street, just east of Yonge Street? So it's Moss Park Armory. I went down there on a non-Swift Watch night because I was watching a chimney somewhere else, but and we watched over 1,000 birds drop into this chimney in about a 2-hour period. So it's quite an impressive site. So I think swifts are quite fascinating in that they are living amongst us. And not only are they living amongst us, they're completely dependent on us for their existence, unless we can figure out having nice old growth trees elsewhere where they can set up shop, which is where they used to live. And so I do think that there are some opportunities to engage kind of beyond the science, and I've thought a lot about how art could be used to make people aware of chimney swifts and try to get people more interested in the design and preservation of chimneys. I'll tell you my fantasy since I have time, which was to buy a bar that has a chimney and then have this live feed of the swifts, and then people can come watch videos of chimneys, but you know, I can't do that right now. But I just want to acknowledge Christine Furtado, the student, and Kelly Snow of Bird Cities Canada, and Lori Green, who's a mosaic artist who did this lovely mosaic for me. So thank you.
One back and then Sue.
So, part of thinking about mitigating wildlife, human wildlife conflict, and I think Brad, you mentioned, we talked about this before, that how do wildlife proof your home? And one of the conversations was about perhaps capping the chimney. And I thought I had it all figured out, and then I hear this, and I'm like, no. So this is where conversations are really important, and also for us at the city as we're developing guidelines, because I thought, yeah, we can do guidelines for buildings, and people can fix their house and make it more. Now I have no idea what to do.
Yeah, well, there has been discussion elsewhere that raccoons could negatively impact chimney swifts because they will also use, chimneys for, hanging out. And so Kelly Snow knows a lot about it, so that I would just encourage you to talk to him.
Yeah,
so that, but it's, it is what it is. Like I think we're not starting from scratch. We're starting from this is what we have, and I think there may be some chimneys that raccoons won't use. They just won't use. And I should say I think I have a slide here. Chimney swifts will only use certain size chimneys, right? So they need to be of a certain size. They're not the tiny ones that are on houses. Like I was kind of lamenting that I got rid of my chimney because it was falling down. It was kind of a liability. But it was actually a very small chimney. And I realized that there's pretty good data that shows that chimney swifts are not using tiny chimneys. They need a certain width chimney. And so those may not be the ones that raccoons are using. And also, if they're on, raccoons are, I'm looking at a chimney right there, like raccoons are not using ones on tall buildings that are really high, right? They're going to use things that are easy to get to.
This is a great, I feel like, so much the dissertation on this. So like, not just human-wildlife interaction, but urban wildlife interacting with each other and the conflict that kind of, and how do you design for urban wildlife interaction?
Yeah.
And especially when one is declining and threatened and one is totally booming. That's problem.
Go ahead, Sue, and I saw.
Yeah, that was great. Just had a question about this sort of seasonality of use, and thinking of my own building where we have pet swifts. People use their fireplaces in the winter, so is it kind of, are the swifts coming in
When it's over.
When it's over.
Yeah, they can detect carbon monoxide. Yeah, and they'll go over, and so they're really showing up, they're eating insects, right? So they're not really showing up prior to middle of May. It depends on how warm the spring is, or how early the spring is, but they will fly over chimneys and hover, and apparently they can detect carbon monoxide.
And one of us was pose a fire threat?
I think the answer is mostly no, but I think people also assume that people are getting their chimneys cleaned regularly. So I think if you didn't, then it may end up accumulating.
I just wanted to comment on Joanna's concern about capping residential chimneys. I've been removing raccoons from chimneys for 32 years, and only once have we ever found chimney swifts in a chimney. And to your point, it was a larger style chimney. And the only reason we got that call was a swift had fallen, one of the young had fallen down to the base of the chimney.
Oh, so that's super interesting data, right? Because it's not, they're not overlapping.
They're not going into,
Yeah.
they're going with the big, tall chimneys that you're
Yeah.
referring to.
But couldn't that just mean that they don't go in the ones that have raccoons? Or the raccoons, the ones that they go in?
It's
It's possible
Like,
because the
if there's
raccoons.
just swifts,
Yeah.
they're not going to call you
Yeah.
or something.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah, because also the raccoons would be occupying. Like if the
Yeah.
raccoons are mostly nocturnal, so they're going to be in the chimney when the swifts are kind of sampling chimneys. So maybe they're kind of already going occupied.
So you're saying raccoons are a bigger threat to the swifts than chimney?
No, I think. Well, no, I think.
No, I'm kidding.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know what to say, Jared. It's he's more exploring.
So Jamie and then.
It's a great story. I wonder, I mean, you mentioned briefly what we know about the history of swifts before the creation of chimneys, because I guess chimneys only came into existence when we started getting coal in the 18th century, I guess, building in those proportions. Are they a particularly adaptive species, or what's the theory about why they transferred so dramatically from old growth trees to chimneys?
Yeah.
Could they possibly do the same?
I think because their distribution is mostly limited to eastern North America, and it coincided with deforestation. So it was like this deforestation, and that we weren't leaving the kind of the old hollow trees that they were using. And so some argue that, and which is likely the case, that they are higher in abundance than their average abundance perhaps pre-European. But most of Eastern North America was forests pre-European. So it's hard to maybe figure out that estimate. They do seem adaptable. They will also go into the sides of houses if there's just gaps. When I was doing my homework last night for this, I saw other things. So they do nest in caves, naturally hollowed out trees, but we'll try and use other structures. I think probably chimneys might be where they have the highest nest success, so they may use it more repeatedly.
So we need, as we transition away from coal, we need an equivalent kind of renewable structure, a turbine with an equivalent.
Yeah, and I think the question is that because when you have heat coming out, just kind of a natural heat coming out of the house, are they also sampling for that? Because then when we have these, the bumblebees, we're having these more dramatic kind of springs and falls. That chimney swifts are also subject to those kind of cold snaps and things if they're around. So kind of the thermal regulation of what they're hanging out in is important.
Gail, maybe you already said this. Are they really site faithful? Do they go back to this? Have you been watching individuals? Do they go back to the same places?
Yes. One of the things that fascinates me about these is whether they're colonial. And I know you're mostly a bunch of social scientists, that's a weird term to use. but I study colonial colonies, the birds, right? So it seems to me in some of the work that we've done in the city that there's clusters, like they're kind of, you could go to one part of the city and you're not really seeing swifts, even though it looks like there's chimneys, but there's others where they're like, all the chimneys are occupied and they're super social. We can see them flying around in flocks and chattering and stuff. So I think there is some aspect of coloniality about them, but they with no banding, I don't have banding data, but I can tell you that the same chimneys are being used from year to year.
So this is going on a different tangent, because you had a slide there that said that 75% of the city sites are unoccupied.
Yeah.
So while it is totally important to keep that habitat there, there's a suggestion that it's the prey that's still remaining back to the population. So I was wondering if you had any comments on, is there any knowledge on what's causing the decline in cells, besides just general deforestation?
The information that was Joe Nocera's work, so he's done both the guano paleoecology study, and that's been replicated. So the impacts of DDT, I think, are still being felt. So it shifted the composition of invertebrate prey that was being used, and it coincides really well with their decline and all the decline we're seeing in these aerial insectivores. So it's not just this species. So it seems as though pesticide use, even though DDT is much, much lower than it was in the 60s, they're suggesting that the decline in these groups of birds started earlier. And so we just started sampling them, in the mid-60s, but probably the decline started far earlier when we started using DDT. They also argue that even though there's the occupancy, there's chimneys unoccupied, that it's important to maintain those chimneys, because if you're hoping to regrow the population, then you need to know that you have habitat for them.
Hi, I was just wondering, is there any research about their migratory grounds and any kind of habitat losses that might be occurring there or contributing to their decline?
Yeah, and this is so true of many, many species that migrate. Very little. Like there's every bird in North America has what's called a species account. It's a great source if you're interested in any species in North America. It summarizes everything that's known and published about that species. And the chimney swifts were updated in 2014, and the line for their winter migration was like 2 sentences long, essentially saying we don't really know anything. So the equipment is getting there, but the miniaturization of tags and stuff is getting there. They're really small birds. Like to put gear on them, and they have almost no legs. Like you would never see a chimney swift perch. If you see a chimney swift perching on a chimney, it's a starling swift. So they're kind of, the body shape, is such that it's hard to also put equipment on them. People have done it, but it's hard. Okay, thank you. Oh, hi, Erin.
First of all, the guano coring, totally got goosebumps. But this is unrelated. I was just thinking about, it's interesting, when you think about chimney swifts as now being a bird that has pretty much an exclusively human habitat, like in the sense that not just human areas, but human buildings, houses. And the other animals that fall into that category, like rats and mice, are notoriously hated. And so I'm just wondering how this sort of is played into maybe education or communication about chimney swifts in terms of people feeling like they depend on us absolutely for their survival, if that's perceived as a positive thing or if that's a challenge.
Yeah, I'm not involved much with the environmental education part of it, but of what I've seen that's out there, that's not the dialogue that's being used. And maybe it should be the dialogue that's being used, right? Because I think if we explained that dependency, they've been described as an urban obligate. They don't really have much else to be nesting in. So it's an interesting idea, certainly, that I could suggest to the people that are doing the environmental ed piece on that.